Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics common to both the PowerBasic console and Windows compilers. Today, we will look at reading basic XML configuration files. Today, we're going to look at a brand new library file called pb.xml. We're going to use this new library to allow us to load configuration XML files. When you're writing applications, you may well be testing them on a test system, and then later releasing them to a live system. There could be constants within your application. For example, a constant to point towards where a server is, where a shared folder on the network is, and these may be different between your test and your live systems. The last thing you want to do, having coded and then tested your application, is to have to change the application again to point it towards the live system. Usually in these circumstances, you would create a configuration file, and this configuration file would be read by the application. Configuration files can come in many formats. They can be plain text files, they can be INI files, but what we're going to look at today is XML files. For each of the applications we'll be writing from now on, we may well have a configuration file in XML format, and contained within that file will be several constants we wish to load into our program. So first of all, let's create a config XML file. I'm going to use a small program called XML This is a very old application that's been around a long time. The version I'm using has been around for nearly 20 years. However, I'll put links in the description below to where you can download a slightly more modern version of this. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, this XML application will suit us nicely. Simply double-clicking on it will give us a control page. This will allow us to create each of the elements and the values that we wish to actually use. First of all, we'll give a name to the root element. We'll call that cluster. And we can create a child element just by double-clicking on here and giving it a name, and then we can put a value in. In this case, we're going to give the name of one of our computers. And to add extra nodes, all we have to do is come down to the next line, and we can put the next node in. Now, if we wish to indent this and have a nested setup, clicking the little arrows allows us to nest or unnest. And we're going to create a node called drive, and we'll give that the value of D, and we'll create another one. So we can quite happily go down here and put in as many nodes that we actually need. These would contain all the configurable information. For example, if we're moving between the tests and the live systems, we could quite happily change this by just copying in a brand new XML file. So we'll just save that XML file, and we'll put that into our work folder. And we'll call it config.xml. And there it is. So anytime we need to actually read the file, we just have to open it up, and there is our information. Now, if we look at the file in Notepad, you'll see that the file format is really quite straightforward. It looks remarkably similar to the kind of hypertext markup language you get for your web pages. There are beginning tags, and there are end tags, and the information between is the information you're looking for, so it's not really a complicated format. XML files can be a lot more complex than this, but for the purposes of what we're doing today, we need just a basic config file. What we will do now is we will attempt to read the information out of the XML file. This is the XML library, which is going to allow us to parse the XML file. Now, I didn't write the original code for this XML library. This came from Marco Pontello and was written quite some years ago. I've made a few small changes to the library, but nothing significant. So having included the library, what do we have to do in the code to actually read our information? Well, we're going to include another file. This is going to be our config file. Since you would be normally hard coding these values within your application, we're going to store them as global variables, so they're available throughout the length and breadth of your application. So I know I have two pieces of information in the XML file, one being the server name and one being the disk drive. So I've created two global variables in which these are going to be stored. Now within our PB main function, its first task is actually to find the XML file and load the information. So we'll save this as config. There's a config.include, and we will put that in following the XML library. So we're going to create a function, a single function within the config library. This function is the one that the PB main is going to call. This will extract the XML values from our XML file and place them within these global variables. The first thing we'll need to do is to tell the application where and what the name of the config XML file is. By this mechanism, you can have a single config file in XML format which is read by all your applications, and all the constants they need could be in that one file. Alternatively, you could have a separate config file for each application. It's entirely up to you. Quite simply, all we have to do within this function is we have to define the section that contains the information I'm interested in. If we have a quick look at the config XML again, we will see that we are reading the cluster and then the server name. This gives you the tree path, as in cluster/server name. And you populate the global variable by calling the simple getXML function, passing it the name and path to the XML file which we've defined above, and the section we are interested in. And then you merely have to repeat this for each of the global variables you wish to pick up. This way, when your PB main function calls this function, then all the global variables are populated at startup, and you never need to read the XML file again. At the end of this function, you can perform as many tests as you think you need to make sure there is enough information to ensure that you have actually located the XML file. That way, if these values are not populated, it means either they're not populated in the XML file, or the function could not find the XML file at all. So if we return true, it's because both of these have been populated. If we cannot find the file, or neither of these are actually populated, then it will return false. So within the main code, we merely have to call this function. So if we go back to the PB main, and we make a call to the getXML values. Now if this returns false, then we could not read the file, or the values within the file are blank. So if we cannot read the file, or we cannot find the file, we'll push a message out to our log, and at that point the application will end. If the file is read correctly, then we can quite simply put the values out to our log, because they are indeed stored within the global variables. So if we try a quick compile on that now, it compiles cleanly, and what this should do, it should pull out the server name and the disk drive from our XML file. So it should pull out octal2, and the disk details as being D. So if we run our program, we'll see it has indeed read the config file, and it has pulled out the server value and the disk drive. So if we quite simply change the value within the XML file, save it, run our application again, and we'll see that the new value is effectively brought out. This is a very simple XML parser. It allows you to read from an XML file, but not to write to it. There are XML libraries that come with Windows that will allow you a great deal more functionality. But this is quite sufficient for a simple config file, where each of the XML nodes is uniquely named. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.